Good evening, boxing fans, and welcome back. Am I the only one who remembers the intensity of the confrontation between Riddick Bowe and Lennox Lewis immediately following Riddick Bowe's victory over Evander Holyfield for the undisputed heavyweight championship of the world?
I'm not afraid of you, Lennox, and we're gonna get it on. I owe you one.
Okay.
You're not the man I thought you was. You lied on me. I thought we was cool.
Yo, bring it on, man.
Yeah, I'm gonna bring it. You ain't said nothing but a word. Freddie Roddick was afraid of you.
I'm gonna knock you out.
You was a chump. You ain't gonna knock nothing out, boss.
I'm gonna knock you out.
You ain't gonna knock nothing out.
You know I'm gonna knock
nothing out. Why like you know it? Do it then. Do it then. We ain't do shit. I ain't know from what my feet.
You're the champion.
You had help from the
You're the
rest.
champion. He's in
Yeah, well, knock me out. Knock me out there, boss.
You ain't nothing to me.
Oh, watch your mouth, fucker.
Hey, look, man, watch your mouth. You ain't nothing to me.
This is Rummy's Corner. So the fight between Riddick Bowe and Lennox Lewis never came to fruition, unfortunately for boxing fans, because I think we would have been in for a real treat had it happened. But this is just one of many examples of logical fights that should have taken place, but never did. And as a recent example, I think of the situation with Sergey Kovalev and Adonis Stevenson, whom, after being featured on a couple of HBO cards together where an inevitable showdown was expected, the fight never came together. And sticking in that division, it wasn't that many years ago where Roy Jones and Dariusz Michalczewski both reigned as co-champions in the same division. I think it was for like 6 years. And inexplicably, those two never faced each other. And as a more recent example of things going on now, it looks like Canelo and Golovkin could be added to that list of logical fights that, for whatever political reasons, never came together. So in the situation with Riddick Bowe and Lennox Lewis, their rivalry actually dates back to the 1988 Olympics in South Korea, where the two of them met in the super heavyweight division finals. And this was an interesting fight that I personally believe gives us very brief glimpses into the incredible matchup that we may have gotten had the two met a few years later as professionals. And it was a pretty even fight in the first round. Lewis seemed to be, I think, in control in the earlier parts of the round, but then about halfway through the round, Bowe started landing a series of good shots, and he looked like the sharper, crisper puncher. He landed some nice uppercuts in there. He was doing some good work to the body, and I think it was a definite Bowe round. I think he lost a point for a bizarre headbutt call or something toward the end of the first round, but Bowe got the best of Lewis. He threw more punches than Lewis. He landed more punches, and most significantly, he landed the most telling blows in that first round. And then in the second round, Lewis came out like a ball of fire, and Bowe was given a standing 8 count, and then Lewis jumped right back on top of him again and hit him with a nice right hand, followed by a decent left follow-up. Bowe was initially given another standing 8 count, but then the fight got waved off altogether, and here's what the commentators at the time had to say on the live broadcast.
One more headbutt, and that's a point off. The next another standing 8. I can't believe this. And we're calling it. The fight is over. Gustav Baumgart of East Germany says it is all over, and the winner is Lennox Lewis of Canada. He felt that Bowe had enough. We have seen some quickie stoppages in the higher weight classifications.
Well, maybe it's a bad day for the American team, but I cannot agree with that at all. I thought Baumgarten was an unnecessary intruding factor. I thought those headbutts that were called were gratuitous at best, and I thought the stoppage was very strange. I mean, very doubtful. We're not in there with the boxer, but from here, it did not look like Riddick Bowe was in any trouble, nor that the punch was particularly effective.
So there was a bit of controversy behind the stoppage. Bowe's camp didn't protest much, and in fairness, Lewis did catch him with some really nice shots in there. So Lennox Lewis won the gold medal for Canada. Riddick Bowe settled for the silver for the United States. And at least with this one, it was nothing like the situation which happened to Roy Jones, but that's another story. So Bowe and Lewis would both move on to the professional ranks where they were brought up and they both had success early on. And then 1992 rolls around. This is a time when Mike Tyson, I believe, had already started his prison stint. Evander Holyfield was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, and fans were treated to a little tournament of sorts. A four-man tournament, where Lennox Lewis would face Razor Ruddick, I believe it was Halloween night 1992. And then a couple of weeks after that, Holyfield would defend the crown against Bowe in a battle of the undefeateds. At the time, many people forget that Razor Ruddick was an extremely highly rated commodity that many people were pegging to win the entire tournament. And Ruddick largely based his reputation on two losing efforts against the now imprisoned Iron Mike. I forget if it was this fight or another fight, I could be getting confused, but I'm pretty sure it was the Ruddick situation where Big George Foreman had said that whenever you have a fighter like Ruddick, whose reputation was entirely predicated on two losing efforts to Iron Mike Tyson, that there was reason to be weary, that there was reason to not be completely sold on that type of fighter. And then Lewis would fight Ruddick, and the first round seemed to be a bit of a feeling out type of round where Lewis, I think, seemed to be getting the better of the action. And then at the end of the first round, Lewis dropped Ruddick with a hard shot. And in the second round, Lewis would jump right on top of him. I think he dropped him 2 more times before the fight was stopped. But Lennox Lewis had just walked through Razor Ruddick at a time when many people were figuring that Ruddick would win the entire tournament. So on to a couple of weeks later, Holyfield and Bowe would have one of the most entertaining fights in heavyweight history with one of the best rounds in heavyweight history in an instant classic. After the fight, I know I showed this earlier, but it's so interesting I'm gonna show it again. And here's the confrontation immediately after winning the heavyweight title, when Riddick Bowe just so happened to run into Lennox Lewis.
I'm not afraid of you, Lennox, and we gonna get it on. I owe you one.
Okay.
You're not the man I thought you were. You lied on me. I thought we was cool.
Yo, bring it on, man.
Yeah, I'm gonna bring it. I'm gonna bring it. You ain't said nothing but a word. Razor Ruddick was afraid of you.
I'm gonna knock you out.
You was a chump. You ain't gonna knock nothing out, Bob.
I'm gonna knock you out.
You ain't gonna knock nothing out.
You know I'm gonna knock
nothing out. Why you know you do it then? Do it then. We ain't do shit. I ain't know from what my feet.
You're the champion.
You had help from the ref. Well, knock me out. Knock me out there, Bob.
You ain't nothing to me.
Watch your mouth, son.
Hey, man, watch your mouth. You ain't nothing to me.
Now this scene that unfolded, I mean, if you were an HBO executive, you would be licking your chops. I mean, there isn't a better situation you could have hoped for following one of the best fights ever, where there's already a built-in story. Bowe and Lewis, controversial stoppage at the Olympics. The two of them were destined to meet again per the agreement of this heavyweight tournament. And then you have this little incident that happens all on camera, all for the public to see. So not only do you have an exciting new champion in Riddick Bowe, you already have a rival that the whole world is fired up to see. So looking back on what would happen next, the common narrative as I see it today, whenever this situation arises, and it does come up quite frequently still, but the common view that I see goes like this. Riddick Bowe wanted nothing to do with Lennox Lewis because of their fight in the Olympics. He was scared of Lennox. He threw the belt in a trash can so that he'd never have to face them. And it was the biggest duck in history. In fact, recently with Canelo relinquishing his belt, not wanting to face Gennady Golovkin at 160, a lot of people are bringing up the Bowe situation and saying this is the most blatant duck since then. But did Riddick Bowe really duck Lennox Lewis the way they said he did? I'm not so sure. It's true that he did throw the belt into a garbage can. And it's true that Lennox Lewis was awarded this belt without having to fight for it in the ring. But the truth of the matter is, I don't think it's so simple as the narrative of Bowe threw the belt in the trash can and then didn't want to fight Lewis. Because I believe there were some earnest efforts to make the fight from both sides on this one. I believe Bowe's camp, Bowe was managed by Rock Newman at the time. I believe Bowe's camp had made 2 offers to Lennox Lewis for the fight to happen, and they rejected both of them. They had a counter offer, but then at some point after that, Frank Maloney, Lewis's manager at the time, had said, yeah, you know what, that is a good deal, we'll take it, and it fell apart. At that point, Rock Newman basically said the ship had sailed, and that Lewis's team blew it by turning down the 2 offers they had initially received. See, to me, this is politics, and politics as usual in boxing. It's not as simple as Bowe ducking Lewis or Lewis ducking Bowe even. I think both of those guys would have wanted to fight. But this is just part of the evil of the undergoings between the powers that be in the sport. And aside from maybe feeling that they blew their chance, I think Rock Newman also really was reluctant to have to deal with the WBC. At the time, Jose Sulaiman and Don King were very closely tied. So with the WBC, we're going to have to eventually go down an avenue with Don King. Am I saying it's right that Riddick Bowe threw the belt in the garbage can? No, I'm not saying that. I wish the fight would have happened. I think it would have been a hell of a fight. But I believe the efforts made to make that fight on the side of Bowe's camp and on the side of Lewis's camp were more earnest, were founded in greater sincerity than the recent efforts that supposedly took place between the camps of Gennady Golovkin and Canelo Alvarez. So Lewis would go on to lose his belt a couple of years later at the hands of the Emanuel Stewart-trained version of Oliver McCall. Bowe would lose his titles a year after he won them. He had 2 what were regarded as pretty soft defenses against Ferguson and Dokes. Then he would have a rematch with the Emanuel Stewart-trained version of Holyfield, and he would lose this rematch. So by the time 1994 rolls around, neither one of these guys has a belt. Both of them had suffered defeats, and in the case of Lewis, it was a 1-punch knockout. And Lewis, ironically, would, after losing to the Emanuel Stewart-trained version of McCall, he would then team up with Emanuel Stewart in what would start one of the more impressive runs in heavyweight history. Anyway, fast forward a couple of years later, and Riddick Bowe had a run as the WBO champion, which was very lightly regarded at the time, but Bowe was still largely being frozen out based on his throwing the WBC belt in the trash can. The WBC, I think, still held some ill will towards Bowe at that point. Lewis was still in their good graces. Mike Tyson had come back out of prison a couple of years after this, and he had regained the WBC title. I think it was in his rematch with Frank Bruno, the guy who had beaten McCall after he'd beaten Lewis. So Tyson's the WBC champion, but then he has a unification bout with Bruce Seldon, paying Lewis step-aside money, ultimately relinquishing the WBC belt himself. And that sets up 1996, where Riddick Bowe would go into a fight against relatively unknown Polish fighter Andrew Galata. And Lewis would finally get the rematch he wanted for the now vacant title, vacated by Tyson. He'd get a chance for that same WBC strap in a rematch with McCall. But McCall probably shouldn't have been fighting at all that night. He had a lot of personal issues going on, and I'm not sure. I think that was rumored that Don King took him right out of rehab, basically straight to the ring. And he had a bit of a breakdown in the ring. So in 1996, and then Lewis would have another fight against Huggin Henry Akinwande, and that was a fight where Akinwande earned his Boxing Forum nickname by getting disqualified against Lewis for excessive hugging. Meanwhile, what was Bowe doing? Bowe was getting his ass kicked both inside and outside the rules in 2 vicious wars with the unknown Polish fighter Andrew Galata. Galata battered Bowe 2 times, the second time more vicious than the first. But despite winning on the cards both times at the time of the stoppage, Galata couldn't resist the temptation to punch Bowe below the belt line. Galata was disqualified both times. At this point in time, Holyfield had been knocked out by Bowe. Tyson had relinquished the belt and would soon be going on to fight and lose to Holyfield. Galata lost to Bowe but battered the hell out of him, and Lewis had two lackluster efforts, not necessarily his fault, against Oliver McCall in their rematch and Henry Akinwande. And then the fight that Lennox had the year before that, the last fight he'd had, was a tough fight with Ray Mercer. At this point in time, it looked as if Galata may have been the best fighter in the division. And what happens when he signs to meet Lennox Lewis after a fight between him and Ray Mercer? I believe it was scheduled. It got canceled for whatever reason. I think an injury from one of the fighters might have even been canceled twice. So then Lewis goes into this fight with Andrew Galata in a fight that was widely viewed as a 50-50 pick'em type of fight, where many in the boxing media were picking Galata to stop Lewis. Lewis goes out there and blasts him out in 95 seconds. And at this point, Lewis established himself as this dominant force. And we go back to Bowe and Lewis. That dream was done at this point because Bowe was effectively retired by Galata. But it should also be noted that before this time, before Bowe was ruined, when he had that WBO stint, he had reached out to Lennox then for a fight too. So it wasn't necessarily a lack of effort on either man's part. It's just one of those things that suck. And the narrative that Bowe was afraid of Lewis and this and that, maybe he was, but I don't think the evidence necessarily supports that point of view when you look at the bigger picture of the bullshit politics that were going on behind the scenes. So who would have won a fight between Lennox Lewis and Riddick Bowe? I really think it depends on when the fight would have happened. If the fight had happened at any point from late 1992 until 1994 when Lewis lost to McCall, I think Bowe wins the fight from that period of 92 to 94. Bowe matured fast. He was on the fast track to superstardom, and he got to his ultimate peak much quicker than Lewis did. Lewis was always fond of telling us years later that he was like a fine wine, something that got better with age. And when compared to Riddick Bowe, this is especially true, because 94 was when Bowe's career really started going south. He was still an excellent fighter, but I think the ballooning up in between fights, the not taking training and the lifestyle as seriously as he did on his way up towards getting the title shot, was never the same since he had become the champion. And meanwhile, Lennox Lewis would have a transformation, because after losing to McCall, he brought in hired gun Emmanuel Stewart to fine-tune his already outstanding skill set. And Stewart managed to turn Lewis into a pretty efficient force. So I think if the fight happened between 92 and 94, I favor Bowe. If it happens in 94, 95, during that early transition where Lewis was learning to perfect Stewart's adjustments to his style, and Bowe, I think, started declining a little bit but still had a little bit left, once we get to that late 94, 95 era, things start quickly shifting to favor Lewis, in my opinion. And at any time from 1996 onwards, the Galata fights had finished Bowe completely, but Bowe already seemed well on that path to decline before Galata. Galata just kind of sped the whole process up, I think. So any time after that, I think Lewis wins, and wins big. But at the end of the day, all we can do is speculate as to how a fight between Riddick Bowe and Lennox Lewis would have went down had it happened in 93, 94, 95, 96, and beyond. We'll never know, because the fight never happened. And the biggest losers in that entire situation were the fans, because it would have been a great fucking fight. I honestly believe that. and just one of many fights that we should have gotten at a specific point in time that we never did for the bullshit corruption that often plagues this sport. This is Rumsfeld. Thank you for tuning in. Please stay tuned for more episodes in the future. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you.